Back in 1991, India was right on the brink of an economic collapse. It was a crisis so deep that it forced the country to completely reinvent itself. So today, we're going to dive into the story of that incredible U-turn, how India went from a closed, protected system to a major global player, and we're going to ask what that whole journey means for its future. Okay, so to really get how big of a deal this change was, you first have to understand just how bad things were. We're talking about the early 90s, and India wasn't the economic powerhouse you hear about today. Not even close. It was a country basically staring over a cliff. Get this, $2.2 billion. That's it. In 1991, that was the total amount of foreign currency reserves India had left. Now, for a country with hundreds of millions of people, that number is absolutely terrifying. Just how small is it? Well, it was barely enough to cover 1 week's worth of imports. That meant India was just days away from defaulting on its international bills, unable to pay for things it desperately needed, like oil. The country was, for all intents and purposes, about to go bankrupt. So, how on earth did it get so bad? Well, it was kind of like a perfect storm. For decades, the government had been spending way more money than it was bringing in through taxes. To plug that hole, India just kept borrowing from other countries, and its external debt just ballooned. Then, the 1991 Gulf crisis hit, messing with oil supplies, and that was pretty much the final straw that broke the camel's back. With its back completely against the wall, India really had no choice but to go to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. And the IMF agreed to help, but on one condition. India had to completely overhaul its economy. This kicked off one of the biggest economic U-turns of the entire 20th century. And this slide really gets to the heart of the huge philosophical shift that happened. Before 91, the economy was closed off. The whole idea was to be self-sufficient, to shield local companies from the rest of the world. But after 1991, that strategy got flipped on its head. The new goal? Open up, join the world economy, push exports, and start competing on a global stage. This whole new approach got a catchy nickname, the LPG model. The L stood for liberalization, which basically meant cutting all the red tape and regulations that were holding businesses back. P was for privatization, meaning the government would step back and let private companies take the lead. And G? Well, that was for globalization, opening the doors to foreign trade and investment like never before. So the doors were officially thrown wide open. And what happened next was, well, it was explosive, but it was also really, really complicated. It turns out this new era of globalization was a classic double-edged sword. Just take a look at these numbers. The growth is just mind-boggling. Exports shot up from less than $18 billion in 91 to over $300 billion just 2 decades later. That's incredible. But then you look at the other columns. Imports grew even faster. And that trade balance, the gap between what you sell and what you buy, it went from being a small problem to a massive one. And this chart here really drives the point home. That trade deficit didn't just grow, it absolutely exploded. So even though India was selling way more stuff to the world, it was buying even more back. So the big question is, why? This quote from our source material really nails it. You have to remember, for decades, Indian industry had been living in this protected bubble. When the floodgates were opened, a lot of those local companies just weren't ready to compete with foreign goods right out of the gate. So you had this huge surge in imports that just blew past export growth. All right, so what was really behind all this? The research points to 3 big forces that were shaping this whole new economic reality. Let's break them down, one by one. First up, joining the World Trade Organization. As a founding member, India had to start playing by new global rules. That meant lowering the tariffs and trade barriers that had kept its industry safe for so long. This, of course, opened the floodgates even wider to foreign competition and sent the flow of trade through the roof. The second driver? It's all about the money. Specifically, the value of India's currency. Over these 2 decades, the Indian rupee kept losing value against the US dollar, and that had this really powerful, two-sided effect on the economy. So, on one hand, a weaker rupee was actually great for Indian exporters. It made their products cheaper for people in other countries to buy, which helped boost sales. But, and this is a big but, it also made everything India imported way more expensive. And since a huge slice of India's import pie is crude oil, something it absolutely needs, that total import bill just kept climbing higher and higher. And the final driver? Well, it turns out that when you join the world economy, you also inherit its problems. By opening itself up, India also made itself vulnerable to global shocks. So when major crises hit, like the 2008 financial meltdown, the shockwaves were felt thousands of miles away in India. So here's a quick rundown of how that worked. A housing bubble in the US burst, which kicked off this massive global financial crisis. Suddenly, the US and Europe were in a deep recession. For India, this was bad news because these were its biggest customers. They suddenly had a lot less money to spend, and demand for Indian exports took a nosedive. It was a tough lesson that being part of the world also means being part of its problems. So you put all of this together, the insane growth, the widening trade deficits, the new vulnerabilities to global shocks, and it's led India to a brand new crossroads. It's facing a fundamental dilemma about what to do next. And this is the question at the absolute heart of the matter. After spending decades rewiring its entire economy to face the world, is it maybe time for India to turn its focus back home, to its own domestic market? And the argument for doing just that is actually pretty strong. By looking inward, India could, in theory, protect itself from the next big global crisis. It could concentrate on developing its own huge internal market, creating jobs and growth at home, and relying less on the whims of both exports and imports. And this final quote from the source material just sums up the whole debate perfectly. After a generation of embracing interdependence with the world, the pendulum might just be swinging back. The idea of economic independence is back on the table. And for one of the world's biggest economies, the answer to that question, what comes next, is going